Welcome to AppStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts. I'm John Voorhees, and with me for a very special episode of AppStories is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. We are always doing special episodes now. What's going on? Why?
I know. I don't know if I'm going to have to change that intro. I don't know that it's still a weekly exploration of the world of apps. It's maybe like every couple of days exploration. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue like weekly does, though.
This is a very special episode, though, because I have new Apple hardware that I've been playing with. Can you tell, John? This is the sound an iPad Air makes when you knock it.
I was going to say that's the sound of air right there.
This is the sound. So yes, I do have the brand new iPad Air. In fact, if you're listening to this, it's very likely that you just arrived on the review that I published on MacStories, and you're probably listening via the AppStories embed that we have on the first page. But yes, I've been playing with this iPad for the past few days, and the review is out on MacStories, and we thought, why don't we also talk about it in a free-form podcast fashion here on AppStories? And the plan is just to let John quiz me and ask me anything, whatever. Also, I should mention up front, before we get into the details of the iPad Air, we do have, as promised, or I should say as teased, I guess, we do have a special surprise for Club MacStories members as well. So you may remember just a few days ago, my iOS and iPadOS 14 review was published. And in the review, in addition to a bunch of perks like the ebooks that we did, there were also some iPhone wallpapers for the home screen that were optimized for widgets. Well, we've done it again, but this time for iPads. So we do have a new collection of iPad wallpapers optimized for landscape usage and the home screen. And these wallpapers are the iPad version of what we did on the iPhone. So there's the same collection of 5 different color variations featuring this sort of like a special platform that hosts the widgets, but this time on iPad, on the left side of the screen. You can see a preview of these wallpapers on the iPad Air review. At the top, there's a promo section that shows you a teaser image of these wallpapers. And of course, you can also find some screenshots in the review itself. We were able with Sylvia to do these wallpapers right at the very last minute. We also included support for the iPad Air. So for the brand, these wallpapers include the new 10.9-inch version for the brand new iPad Air, which is launching to the public this Friday. But if you're a Club MacStories member, you can already download the wallpapers. When you do get the new iPad Air this week, you will already have a brand new shiny wallpaper waiting for you.
That is fantastic. I will venture to say that perhaps these are the very first iPad Air wallpapers anywhere.
I would say so. I think so.
So grab them while you can. And if you've just landed on the show for the first time using the embed, consider subscribing to AppStories, because we cover an awful lot of apps week in and week out, and it's a great way to kind of make the most of your iOS devices and your Mac. All right, Federico, I want to dig into this because I have ordered an iPad Air, and I am really looking forward to getting a preview from you as to what exactly it is that I've purchased. And I guess I want to start.
I was like, I can answer that.
I guess first I will tell you why I bought it.
Okay.
I am a big fan of the iPad mini, as you know, since I kind of convinced you to buy one. But my wife's iPad mini broke recently, and I gave her mine. And so right now I have my iPad Pro 12.9-inch, and that's it. And I really, that iPad, while I love it for work, for writing especially, it is not great for lying on the couch and watching a movie or maybe reading in bed or that kind of thing. And while I would like another mini, I feel like the mini is ripe for an update. And so I'm not going to buy one of those now. And I thought, you know what? Maybe this Air will serve kind of that purpose, but also have a different set of qualities that will allow me to do things with it that just weren't great with the Air. And I'm thinking in particular more work-related type things like writing when I want something that's a little smaller. But in any event, I want to start with that. I want to start with the size. I want to get a sense from you. How big is this thing? How does it compare to the other iPads that you've used?
Okay, so the best way to think about the iPad Air is it is essentially the 11-inch iPad Pro.
Okay.
It is nearly indistinguishable from the 11-inch iPad Pro. At a glance, if you didn't know where to look, they look almost exactly the same. They are the same size, I believe, and I studied my US measurements. So
your imperial
let me try
measurements.
my imperial measurements. Let me try. I believe there is a 0.02-inch difference in the width of the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, in that the iPad Air is ever so slightly smaller than the iPad Pro 11-inch. I believe it's 2 millimeters
I was going to say
smaller.
there's very small, very few millimeters
It's a
too.
very small difference. They look almost exactly the same. They have the same footprint. They have basically the same weight. I believe there's like a 10-gram difference. So it's basically non-existent. The design is the same. So the flat sides, it's the iPad Pro industrial design, but done on the iPad Air. There are, of course, some ways to tell them apart. One of them is that on the iPad Air, the bezels around the display are slightly thicker, are slightly wider than on the iPad Pro. The iPad Pro has slightly narrower bezels, and if you compare them side by side, you can tell the difference. I don't think it's that big of a difference to tell them apart instantly, especially if you're not used to the iPad Air. I think if you saw them tomorrow in an Apple store and they asked you, can you tell them apart without looking at the sides, without looking at the rear camera and whatnot,
Right.
I think you would struggle to tell the difference. There are two differentiating factors here. One is the rear camera module. So the iPad Pro 2020 has the big camera bump with the ultra wide camera and the LiDAR scanner. The iPad Air does not. The iPad Air only comes with a 12 megapixel wide camera. And this is the same 12 megapixel wide camera of the iPad Pro, literally the same one. But it doesn't have the additional ultra wide, and it doesn't have, the big square camera bump.
Right.
It's got a single lens. So that's one. The other difference, of course, is the Touch ID button. The iPad Air does not have a true depth camera system featuring Face ID. There's no Face ID on this iPad, which this is one of the themes that I explored in my review. I called it the contradiction of the iPad Air, in that it looks like an iPad Pro, it behaves like an iPad Pro because it's got the same gesture-based interaction system. Very fluid use, gestures for multitasking, for the app switcher, for multi-window, but it doesn't have the same authentication system of the iPad Pro. It doesn't have, a few years ago when we were discussing why is Apple getting rid of the home button on the iPad Pro, and we all agreed, well, it's for Face ID. They're getting rid of the home button for Face ID. But on the iPad Air, it kind of feels like a contradiction because they got rid of the physical home button, but there's no Face ID.
Right.
And the Touch ID button is the other difference, right? Is the if you look at the side, you will see this. It's like an elongated top button. It's longer and slightly thicker, and has a bit more of a bump compared to the standard top button in other iPad Pro models.
Is it still kind of like a metal button, or is it?
It's got a glossy finish.
Yeah, because I was going to say, when like on a MacBook Pro, when you have Touch ID and you have the power button on one of those, it's not a metal button. It's more like a glass button, maybe, or maybe it's some sort of plastic of some kind.
It's got a glossy finish of the same color of the iPad Air model that you choose. So it's glossy. I don't know what the material is. It kind of feels like glossy ceramic. I'm not sure, but I think you may be right that it's actually made of glass. It's definitely glossy, and it stands out compared to the rest of the unit because the rest of the unit is made of aluminum, right? With this colored texture. It's more matte, and this one is glossy. And you can instantly see it at the side of the device, and you can also feel it, right? Because it's longer, and because it's got that bit of a bump that makes it really easy to identify. I don't know about you, but whenever I need to reach out to the top button on my iPad Pro, every so often I slide my index finger up and down for like a fraction of a second to make sure that I can
Right.
hit the button. This one you can instantly feel. Maybe because it's got a bit of a bump or because it's longer, but it's definitely easier to identify. But yeah, when you look at the side of the device, you can immediately see this button. It's longer and glossy.
How does it compare to the volume buttons?
It's much bigger.
Okay.
Yeah, it's much bigger than it's like almost double the size of a single volume button. Looking at just the display, right, in isolation, without these two factors, without these other details, it really does look like an 11-inch iPad Pro, and in practice, it works like an 11-inch iPad Pro, right? It's got the same.
Right.
I believe in terms of resolution, we're looking at a 28 pixel difference between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air.
Yeah.
Basically almost the same resolution. And they have the same home screen layout. So the same grid, the same dock, the same widget layout. Nothing is different about these two iPads when it comes to how iPadOS lays out the interface. Multi-column works the same way. You don't get 3 columns by default in Apple apps like Notes and Mail, which is exactly what I wrote about the 11-inch iPad Pro in my iPadOS 14 review. Multitasking is the same. Like it's literally, it looks like the same iPad, but this one is an iPad Air.
All right. I want to ask you a couple of other questions before we dig in further. But one is, I think people are going to wonder, what color did you get and how do you like it?
So my review unit was a sky blue iPad Air. I also got the Magic Keyboard, second generation Apple Pencil, and the deep navy Smart Folio. Now, the short version is that I don't like either of these colors. So the sky blue, it's a very light and subtle shade of blue. If you're thinking about the blue tones that you saw on the iPhone 12 and iPhone
Right.
12 Pro, well, don't think about those colors because this is not like those colors. This is a very light and subtle shade of blue that in broad daylight, you can tell that it's a very light blue. But when you use it indoors and you have like LED lights or regular fluorescent lights,
Mm-hmm.
it almost looks silver. It doesn't
Yeah.
really look blue.
Yeah. My sense of it is that it's almost more like a standard aluminum color with a slight tint of blue overlaid on it, maybe?
Yeah, it does look like that. And like, I'm looking at it now, right? I'm recording in my bedroom with the standard fluorescent light behind me.
Uh-huh.
It looks silver. It does look silver.
Right.
It doesn't look blue. And the
All
deep
right.
navy of the Smart Folio,
Oh, yeah.
what I don't understand is the mismatch between making a deep navy Smart Folio for an iPad model that is available in sky blue.
No.
The deep navy blue is too deep, and the sky blue is too subtle. And so the deep navy Smart Folio, it does look very blue, right? But the iPad doesn't. And what I guess I'm confused about is why does the iPad Pro 11-inch or the 12.9-inch offer a light blue version that is not available on the iPad Air?
Right.
Surf blue, I believe it's called.
Right. There's so many different blues now. That's probably my favorite one of all of them is that cover for the 11-inch iPad
Yep.
Pro comes in a very nice blue, which actually, although I think I would prefer the iPad Air to also have a darker, more vibrant blue itself. I think it would pair an awful lot better than the navy one. All of the covers for this iPad Air are very muted colors, from my recollection looking on the Apple Store.
Yeah.
This episode of AppStories is brought to you by Concepts. Concepts is the infinite canvas app for iPad and iPhone that offers endless idea exploration. It's ideal for all sorts of uses. Visual thinking, note-taking, and mind mapping are just a few, but it's also great for things like storyboards, sketching, illustration, graphic design and product design, and even architecture. Sketch, design, and communicate your ideas with liquid ink, editable vector lines, and flexible exports that work in any app. Create great-looking notes and drawings with the Designer Copic color palette licensed by 2 Corporation. Movable vector lines allow you to organize and edit your ideas with simple gestures. Drag and drop images, vector objects, and text straight onto the canvas for quickly organizing your thoughts and sketching. Design tools like grids, snap, shape guides, and scale measurement enable polished professional sketching for architects and designers. An automatic presentation mode lets you connect your device to any display for instant live sharing. The app's PDF feature lets you mark up, edit, create, and sign documents too. The app is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, HP, Nike, PlayStation, Unity, and a whole lot of other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes free as a basic sketching app with the ability to unlock features via a subscription or a one-time purchase. Go to concepts.app to learn more about this terrific Infinite Canvas app. Again, that URL to learn more about Concepts and how it can help you think visually is concepts.app. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show. All right, Federico, you've just told me a little bit about what that Touch ID button is like and what it feels like and what it's shaped like, but how does it work? Because, we're all used to using home buttons. We're all used to using Face ID, but this is, despite being a larger button than your typical power button, it still sounds like it's a fairly narrow button. How well does it work?
So in my experience, it works really well. The performance of the Touch ID sensor is essentially comparable to the Touch ID, like the second generation Touch ID that we used to have on older iPhone models. So the short version is it's fast, it works well, and it supports either orientation. The longer version, when you set up an iPad Air from scratch, there's obviously like a new Touch ID page during setup. And that, has updated graphics that show you the Touch ID button along the top edge of the display. And you can add your first fingerprint, right, with the same procedure of the old Touch ID days. Like you scan your fingerprint, you do a first scan, and then you're asked to do a second one to get a more precise image of your fingerprint.
Mm-hmm.
What I noticed as an interesting detail is that after you add your first fingerprint to Touch ID on the iPad Air, the onboarding setup flow asks you to add a second one, and the message says basically so that you can more easily unlock iPad in either orientation. So they basically suggest that you rotate your iPad and you add a second fingerprint. And I guess the idea is that Apple knows, right, that people are going to be using an iPad in multiple orientations. And so directly during the setup flow, they ask you, hey, why don't you also add a second one for maybe the other orientation and the other finger that you think you're going to be using. So I added my 2 index fingers because I thought, well, I'm going to be using the left index finger when I'm like in laptop mode with the Magic Keyboard. I'm going to reach out with my left index finger because that's the closest one to the Touch ID button. But then when I'm holding the iPad in portrait, I'm going to add my right index finger because that's the one I'm going to be holding the iPad up, in portrait. That's going to be closest to the Touch ID button. And what I notice is that even if you rotate the iPad by 90 degrees, the fingerprint keeps working. So that's a very nice touch. It only stops working if you literally put the iPad upside down with the Touch ID button all the way to the bottom. But I mean, who's going to be using an index finger with Touch ID at the bottom? I guess if you really want to do that, you should add your thumb as a fingerprint because that's going to be more convenient to use. But really, I guess you shouldn't be putting the Touch ID button. I mean, you can do it because the software will rotate for you, but I guess it's not optimized for that. But as long as you rotate it by 90 degrees, it's going to be fine.
How fast is it?
It's fast. It's like having an iPhone 7, really. It takes a split second on the lock screen. And I guess I should mention there's 2 different ways that you can go about it. I was
going to ask about that.
You can either wake the display by touching the display with your finger or using like a space bar if you have a connected keyboard.
Right.
And when you do, you will see a message appear on screen near the location of the Touch ID button saying Touch ID, and you need to rest your finger to unlock. And it takes like about a split second, right? It says rest your finger and you unlock the device. Or with the display turned off, you can place your finger on the Touch ID sensor, click it, and that will wake the display and unlock the device if you rest your finger for like half a second.
Right.
It's not, I think it's even shorter than half a second. But yeah, it's basically
Sure.
the same performance of the iPhone 7, I think, or the iPhone SE for that matter.
I've gotten really spoiled with the iPad Pro because, especially since I have it almost always connected to a keyboard, just hitting that space bar and having it both wake up and almost immediately recognize me, because especially when you're working at a table or something, it's kind of set up in advance for the perfect orientation for Face ID. How does typing on it feel and using it when you're using Touch ID? If you have to reach up like that, is that too
Yeah.
much of a pain or what?
Well, I think this is also one of the points that I made in the review. I think coming from the iPad Pro, I do find it inconvenient to having to lift my hands off the keyboard, because I'm so used to sitting in front of my iPad Pro, opening the Magic Keyboard, pressing the space bar, and Face ID takes care of everything for me, right? I don't have to
Right.
do anything myself. And I'm very used to that. And so if we were to compare my experience with the iPad Pro to the iPad Air, I would say yes, I prefer Face ID myself. However, and this is also one of the points that I highlighted multiple times in the review, I don't think it's necessarily fair to compare the iPad Pro to the iPad Air in terms of, are people actually going to be switching from an iPad Pro to an iPad Air, right? I don't think if you're an iPad Pro customer, you're going to be looking at the iPad Air as your next upgrade. I think most people who are going to be interested in this iPad Air are going to be people who, like you and me, maybe use it as a second iPad. And in that case, yes, it makes sense to do the comparison. But really, most people upgrading to this device will be owners of a previous iPad Air or a base model iPad or
Right.
maybe, I guess, an old, like a 2015 iPad Pro with Touch ID. But otherwise, I think if you're coming from those devices, the new Touch ID works just as well. It's just in a different location. And in return, you get the edge-to-edge display. I think there's I try to be very careful in terms of thinking of this iPad Air as the upgrade option for existing owners of an iPad Pro. I think if you already have an 11-inch iPad Pro, this is not an upgrade for you, right? If you don't have an iPad, then it's a different discussion.
I'm very curious to try it because I have never owned an iPad Air, and it's been a very long time since I've had a kind of a base model one as well. The Mini was my first non-pro iPad in quite a few years. You used to be an iPad Air user back in the day, didn't you?
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the old stories that I mentioned in the introduction of the review is how the iPad Air was the first the iPad Air 2 actually was really the first iPad model that made me feel comfortable using the iPad as my main computer. And I had this story in 2015, before iOS 9, before the first iPad Pro, titled "How the iPad Air 2 Became My Main Computer." That was one of my first sort of breakthrough pieces about using the iPad as my primary computer. And so I have really fond memories of the iPad Air, because something that I think always stood out historically about the iPad Air is how it's always provided sort of like a glimpse of the future in a very mainstream package, right? And I think this is as true of the new about the new iPad Air as it used to be in the past, because this iPad Air, I think it's a very fascinating device because it blends, right, certain features from the iPad Pro with a device that is not designed for professionals, right? And at the same time, it also gives us an idea of where the iPad line may be going next. So let me explain. You have the industrial design of the iPad Pro, the edge-to-edge liquid retina display, and you have the same gesture-based interactions with iPad OS. At the same time, you don't have things like ProMotion or things like the LiDAR scanner or the same multi-core performance of the A12Z, and you don't have the extra two gigabytes of RAM. But then, and so you're missing some features from the iPad Pro experience. But then you have the A14 Bionic,
Yep.
and you have Touch ID embedded in the top button. And both of these features are not available on any iPad Pro model. The iPad Pro, the existing iPad Pro line is still based on the 7 nanometer A12 architecture. And it's got Face ID, of course, but it doesn't have Touch ID embedded in the top button as an option. So this iPad Air is sort of a stuck, but not in a negative sense, stuck in between the iPad Pro, the professional line of iPad, and being the mainstream iPad, while at the same time having this sort of a forward-looking features. And when you consider it all together, I think it makes it really fascinating. And I'm gonna spoil my conclusion, I guess. I'm sorry, I apologize. If you're looking for a tablet, an iPad in the 11-inch sort of a form factor, and you don't care about the features that are still exclusive to the iPad Pro, and I have a very easy list that you can read in the review that basically gives you the breakdown. If you don't care about those, this is the iPad that I recommend. If you're looking for an 11-inch iPad and you don't care about ProMotion and high storage options and things like LiDAR, I guess, this is the iPad you should be getting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the fact that this sits at a crossroads between the Pro line and the rest of the iPads is borne out too by the performance, because I know you ran some Geekbench numbers, and the single core performance of that A14 outperforms any of the Pro model iPads that are out right now, but it does lag behind on the multi-core side of things.
Yes, it outperforms in single core performance and it lags behind in multi-core, which is not a surprise given the architecture of the A12X and the A12Z on the 2020 iPad Pros. But what I think it's really interesting here, so obviously the A14 built with a 5 nanometer process, obviously this thing is a beast, right? And we're going to see the kind of performance also on the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 12 Pro. But all these, like these numbers, in my reviews, I try not to obsess over benchmarks and these numbers because they don't really tell the full story. The full story is how does it actually feel in practice when you're using the iPad, and what kind of things can you do? Like, what are the things, not the numbers? It's not that I don't care about the numbers. I just think they're numbers.
Right.
However, in the context of Apple as a company, they're switching to their own system on a chip architecture. The A14 makes me wonder, by the time that Apple makes an A14X or an A14Z, what kind of insane performance will we be getting out of that chip?
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was looking at these numbers as well, because if you kind of extrapolate out what might this look like with the Z or the X behind it, it could be pretty astounding. And you're right. I think these numbers, they are just numbers. What it really comes down to is what kind of work are you doing and what kind of apps are you running, right?
So don't get me wrong. I mean, if you're the kind of person who needs an iPad Pro, right? Because you are a video professional, because you take hundreds of photos that you need to move in and out of your iPad. And by the way, the iPad Air, for example, one of the things that it lacks compared to the iPad Pro, the iPad Air is limited to 5 gigabit per second USB-C transfers, whereas the iPad Pro supports up to 10 gigabit per second transfers.
Right.
So that's one of the things, right? But if you need the performance of the iPad Pro because you use apps like Pixelmator or LumaFusion, Photoshop, these CPU and GPU intensive apps, you should be getting an iPad Pro. And especially if you need the kind of built in storage that an iPad Pro offers you. The iPad Air maxes out at 256 gigs of storage, whereas you can buy an iPad Pro for up to 1 terabyte of storage. You just
Right.
don't have that option on an iPad Air. I'm not saying that people should stop purchasing the iPad Pro. I just think that when the performance, like one of the tests that I have in my review is about exporting 4K video using iMovie with the 2020 iPad Pro and the new iPad Air. And in exporting a 4 minute and 30-second video to 4K from iMovie, there was a 17-second difference between the 2020 iPad Pro and the iPad Air. The iPad Air was 17 seconds slower than the iPad Pro. And I mean, that's not a lot. You can wait. You can probably wait 17 seconds.
Right.
If you're a video professional, obviously those seconds, they add up over time. So I think for you, if you're the kind of person, it is absolutely essential. And I mean, you know me, I've always advocated in the past for getting the best possible hardware that you require. I just feel like it's right there in the name, right? This iPad Air, it's not called iPad Pro, but it gives you almost iPad Pro levels of performance thanks to the A14, which I think is outstanding as a thing, in and of itself. So
yeah, it really is amazing.
So I think ultimately the takeaway from all of this is that in 2020, now that we have this iPad Air, I think the most important question that you should ask yourself if you want an iPad Pro isn't necessarily about, do I get the 11-inch iPad Pro or do I get the iPad Air? I think what you should ask yourself is, do I need a 12.9-inch iPad Pro in my life?
Mm-hmm.
I think
absolutely.
given these differences between the iPad Air and the 11-inch Pro, I feel like the iPad Air makes a stronger case for an 11-inch tablet than the 11-inch iPad Pro does. So the question is, do you want a really big iPad Pro? Which makes me wonder, and this was from my conclusion of the review, I feel like, and this is my personal theory, my speculation, that in doing an 11-inch iPad Air, based on the same design and interactions of the 11-inch iPad Pro, yes, with some technical differences, but I feel like Apple is sort of giving themselves room to explore even bigger size options in the iPad Pro in the future. I feel like the iPad Air sort of raises the baseline for the iPad family. And now Apple has a very strong option for an 11-inch tablet that they can sell to consumers that doesn't necessarily, basically you can get an iPad Air, the very base model, for $200 less than an iPad Pro.
Right. And you could end up with an iPad Pro 12.9 being the smaller iPad Pro someday. Who knows, right?
Mm-hmm. So I just feel like if this is the new mainstream consumer iPad that gives you great performance in a compact form factor, I don't know what's in the future of the 11-inch iPad Pro. And again, I'm not saying that it's not worth it. I'm saying that on balance, this feels like the iPad Air feels like a better deal.
Yeah, well, I think the market for the 11-inch iPad Pro has just shrunken dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
I will push back on you in one area on the 11-inch Pro, which is I've had this on my mind because I did a story about Adobe Max, right? And about what Adobe is doing on the iPad. They've now got Illustrator, Photoshop, Lightroom, Fresco. These are all really powerful apps, and they are all very heavily pencil-based. And one thing that I think we should talk about is the lack of ProMotion on the Air, because it's not just a matter of whether it scrolls as smoothly on one versus the other device. That also impacts how the pencil input works, even though this supports the second generation Apple Pencil. And that could be an important consideration for someone who's doing that sort of work in Adobe apps and other similar apps.
Absolutely. And in fact, ProMotion and the storage options are the two most important features, the two most important differences that I mentioned between the 11-inch iPad Pro and the new iPad Air. Basically, you can tell that it's not a ProMotion display. Especially if you're used to the iPad Pro, if you're used to that fluidity of the high display refresh rate, you can absolutely tell the difference. It's like going back to an old iPad. You can immediately tell the difference even if you swipe across pages of the home screen. The difference is immediately noticeable if you're used to ProMotion, especially on a large display. People don't notice the difference on an iPhone because it's such a smaller display, but on a display of 11 inches or almost 13 inches, you can instantly tell. And in terms of Apple Pencil input, yes, you can also see the difference there. I mean, I'm not an artist, I'm not a creative professional, but I did some tests with the Apple Pencil, just drawing straight lines very quickly, and you can see that the virtual ink on the iPad Air sort of lags behind the Apple Pencil, whereas on the iPad Pro with the ProMotion display, it stays almost attached to the Apple Pencil tip, and that's because of the work that Apple has put into not just ProMotion, but in optimizing latency and using machine learning to make sure that the virtual ink can always follow the tip of the pencil that closely. They're using the same machine learning model on the iPad Air, but at that point, it's just a matter of physics, right? You don't have that 120 hertz refresh rate, and you can tell the difference. It's not like it's lagging like 2 meters behind, but if you do a side-by-side comparison, you can tell.
Right, but the screen is being drawn essentially at half the rate of the Pro, so that's going to make a difference. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The other thing, this is a more minor thing, I guess, but the lack of the true depth camera does make a difference, not just in the fact that you can't take portrait mode selfies, but there are other aspects, other software aspects that limits too, right? And you cover those in your review.
By lacking true depth, you also don't get very important Memoji and Animoji.
There you go.
You don't get those because there's no true. You can still use Memoji stickers, of course, right? Because those Memoji characters will sync from your iPhone to the iPad Air via iCloud, but you will not be able to do your own videos and animations because there's no true depth camera. Which also means if you're one of the few 100, I want to say, users of the Clips app, you will not be able to use the scenes, the virtual scenes, based on the true depth camera.
Okay, Federico, we have two things still I want to talk to you about. One is, before we turn our attention to the accessories that you've been trying, I want to ask you about the audio, because one of the things that I love about my iPad Pro is that if I'm sitting at the kitchen table, I don't even get, send the music to my HomePod a lot of the time. I just play it on my iPad because it's such good sound and it's so full because it has those 4 speakers at each corner of the device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Apple calls it the 2-speaker audio landscape mode.
Okay.
I mean, it's right there on apple.com. I'm not making this up. It doesn't sound nearly as good as the 4-speaker system of the iPad Pro. The iPad Pro sounds richer and full, and the iPad Air sounds worse. It sounds more compressed. It sounds... I know that this is not necessarily the proper word, but it sounds smaller. It sounds like a smaller soundstage overall. Bass is more compressed, and you don't get the same clarity. You don't get the same rich, full sound of the 4-speaker system. A good way to think about it is this. I would recommend an iPad Pro as a decent quality portable speaker that you can use around the house. I would listen, and I have listened, to an album in full on an iPad Pro at maximum volume. I wouldn't say, and I wouldn't do the same on an iPad Air. It's more of it's a functional speaker system, it doesn't sound terrible. It doesn't sound bad. But if you did a comparison to the iPad Pro, it doesn't sound nearly as good. It sounds
Yeah, I can
exactly
imagine.
half as good.
And probably twice as good as the iPad mini, if not more, I'm
Oh,
sure,
yeah,
because
exactly.
the mini has a terrible speaker.
You see, the mini is what you use for answering the door, right? It's that kind of like speaker quality. It's a very poor
Right. Right.
speaker. But yeah, the iPad Air, it's right there in the middle. And also, and I can like, I have both the iPad mini and the iPad Pro. And so the iPad Air is right there in the middle of those two. It's not as terrible as the iPad mini, not as good as the iPad Pro.
Okay, Federico, you mentioned that you got some accessories with this as well, and I'm really curious to hear about the keyboard. This is exactly the same keyboard as the 11-inch iPad Pro, right?
Now, this is literally the Magic Keyboard for the iPad Pro 11-inch. It says so on Apple.com. It says iPad Magic Keyboard for iPad Pro 11-inch and 4th generation iPad Air. The box that arrived with my review unit, it says Magic Keyboard for iPad Pro 11-inch. So it is that keyboard that also happens to work with the iPad Air. And in terms of the camera cutout in the back, the Magic Keyboard was designed originally for the 2020 iPad Pros with a big camera bump featuring the 2 lenses and the LiDAR scanner. But it also, as we all know, it also works with the 2018 iPad Pro, right? Even though it featured a single lens. Well, using the Magic Keyboard with the iPad Air has the same visual effect of using a Magic Keyboard with the 2018 iPad Pro. You get the big cutout and a single lonely lens
in the corner.
in the corner of that cutout. It's really the same visual effect. It's not pretty, I guess, but I mean, who cares, right? It works. It's fine.
And you're really only looking at that when it's closed. I mean, when I'm using it with the keyboard, it's on the backside, so I'm not seeing it anyway.
Exactly. Oh, and also I should mention, I haven't tested the photographic capabilities of the iPad Air at all. I'm sorry. I think the only time I take a picture on my iPad is when one of my dogs is doing something particularly funny that I need to capture right away, and my phone for some reason is not around. So I'm sure that somebody else will have examples of photos taken on an iPad Air. My review doesn't. I apologize.
Isn't this how you scan all of your statements of all your stocks when your broker sends you your statements?
I use my iPhone for that.
Oh, all right.
It's better camera. Why? Yeah.
Well, Federico, what's interesting about this to me is the contrast between what I was doing with an iPad Pro 12.9 and a mini, and now, since I don't have the mini, going to this iPad Air, because what I did was not only did I order the iPad Air, but I ordered the Smart Keyboard Folio. I didn't go with the fancy Magic Keyboard, and that was on purpose, not just because it's cheaper, or less expensive, I guess is what
more affordable.
More affordable. That's good. You can use the word more. But here's the thing. I want this to be potentially my ultra light writing device.
Okay.
And the Magic Keyboard and the 12.9-inch iPad Pro is kind of chunky. It's fine around the house. It's fine when you throw it in a bag and take it out, but you don't necessarily want to carry it with you all day long. And I think having an alternative that's a little lighter might be kind of fun. It does, I guess, in a way concern me that it's so close to the size of the 11. I'd almost prefer it to be a little smaller, but it would be really hard to have a decent keyboard at anything smaller than 11 inches or the size of the iPad Air. So I'm really curious to see how it works for that particular purpose. But I do think and I think you touch on this in the review too, it's in a lot of ways, this is far more flexible than you're going to get with something like the 12.9-inch iPad Pro.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that was true of the 11-inch iPad Pro as well, right? But then again, that costs more than an iPad Air.
Right.
So I think the 11-inch form factor is the best one for most people, right? Because it strikes that balance of portability, being able to use it with one hand, which is so important for an iPad if you're going to read a book or articles on the web or something in your RSS client, for example. but also it can be big enough in landscape, especially now that it's got this edge to edge display. So I think the 11-inch form factor, as a size for a tablet, is the ideal one for most people, which makes it almost by default more flexible, more versatile than a 12.9-inch iPad, which is more designed for desk use, right? You're going to be using the big iPad Pro at a desk with a keyboard, with a trackpad, whatever. You can hold it, and I do detach my iPad Pro and I hold it. It's a very big book when I hold it.
It is.
So it's more optimized. The big iPad Pro is optimized for desk usage. The 11-inch form factor, which includes the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, is optimized for everything. And that idea of being optimized for everything makes it more, if you will, iPad. Sort of, it really nails the essence of being an iPad more than something like the 12.9.
Okay, Federico. Well, I'm really looking forward to Friday and having my iPad show up too. I got the blue one just like you're using. So yeah, I'm looking forward to giving it a try. I want to thank our sponsor again for this special episode, and that is Concepts. You can find me and Federico writing over at MacStories.net. Federico is at Viticci on Instagram and Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.